All right. Okay, tēnā koutou and welcome to this Fulbright New Zealand Good Works presentation. My name is Therese Lloyd and I'm the Senior Comms Person here at Fulbright New Zealand. Today we are honouring the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples. And by honouring that, we are having this very special panel discussion featuring some of Aotearoa's leading Māori scholars, all of whom are also Fulbright New Zealand and Fulbright-Ngā o te Māramatanga alumni. So before I introduce everyone today, before I introduce our guests, just a quick housekeeping reminder to all of those who are jumping on that you need to keep your computers muted throughout the course of the discussion. Hopefully we're going to have time for questions at the end, and you can either type those into the chat box as we go, or you can simply just unmute your computer and call them out. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce today's speakers. Dr. Nepia Mahuika is the convener of history at the University of Waikato. He has served as chair of Te Pōhere Kororo, Māori Historians Collective of Aotearoa, and is a past president of the National Oral History Association of New Zealand. Dr. Mahuika specialises in New Zealand history and Māori and iwi histories, oral history, historical theory and methodology, Indigenous histories, and history and ethics. In 2019, he was the inaugural recipient of the Judith Binney Fellowship. Dr. Mahuika was awarded a Fulbright New Zealand Scholar Award in 2013, where he researched the roles of oral histories and oral traditions as historical sources for Native American and Māori peoples. That was at the University of Illinois. Welcome, Dr. Mahuika. Next on our list, we have Maia Wikaira. Maia is Tumuaki Whakaerai, is that correct? Gave it a bash. Managing Director at Fire Legal. Maia worked for the largest federally recognised tribe in California, the Yurok tribe. There she was admitted to practice Yurok tribal law and also represented the tribe in engagement with federal, state and other tribal governments. Maia maintains her practicing certificate in Yurok tribal law. And before her time in the US, Maia worked at Russell McVeigh in their resource management, Māori legal and commercial litigation teams, and at Kahui Legal. Maia has appeared in the Waitangi Tribunal, Environmental Court, Māori Land Court, High Court and Court of Appeal. Maia was awarded the Fulbright-Ngā o te Māramatanga Graduate Award in 2016 and completed a Master's in Environmental Law and Policy at Stanford University in California. Welcome, Maia. Next, we have Dr. Jason Mika. Jason is a senior lecturer in the School of Management and co-director of Te Ao Rangahau Massey Business School's Māori Business Research Centre. Dr. Mika's research interests include Indigenous entrepreneurship, management and methodologies. Dr. Mika was awarded the Fulbright-Ngā o te Māramatanga Scholar Award in 2019 and researched the design of effective enterprise assistance for Indigenous entrepreneurs at Stanford University. Welcome, Dr. Mika. And our final guest, final panelist today is Dr. Tahu Kukutai. She is co-director of Ngā Pai o te Māramatanga and Professor of Demography at the National Institute of Demographic and Economic Analysis at the University of Waikato. She specialises in Māori and Indigenous demographic research and has written extensively on issues of Māori population change, Māori identity, official statistics, and ethnic and racial classification. Dr. Kukutai was awarded a Fulbright New Zealand Graduate Award in 2002 and attended Stanford University to undertake a PhD in demography. Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. And I'll now hand over to Tahu, who is going to facilitate today's chat. Thanks.
Tēnā koe, Therese, tēnā koutou katoa, nau mai haere mai ki tēnei webinar o te mahi pai, o te Good Works. Ko waiau, ko Tahu Kukutai tōku ingoa, he uri ahau no ngā te tipa, ngā tikino haku me te au Pōuri, no rea tēnā rā tātou katoa. So I've drawn the long straw for today's webinar, and we decided amongst ourselves, actually, rather than having a sort of like a rolling wall of PowerPoint presentations, which has its advantages and disadvantages, that instead would have a bit of fun, because we don't often get to sit with each other, even virtually, and sort of whakawhiti kōrero. And instead would have sort of an informal facilitated discussion, and really wanted to sort of dig deep around today's theme, which is, of course, Indigenous Peoples Day around the world, starting here in Aotearoa. So it's appropriate that we have this conversation today. So I really just first want to acknowledge Fulbright for developing this initiative, and of course Ngā Pai o te Māramatanga, who's had been in partnership with Fulbright to offer a range of really innovative and rewarding scholarships over the years to enable our best and brightest to go to the United States and to study and contribute to Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous research. So without much further ado, I think we'll just go around the Zoom room, and should we just start with sort of like an ease into it pātai, aku hoa mahi, and maybe we'll start with you, Nepia, and feel free also as well to just sort of situate yourself in the way that you feel comfortable. I know you're an uri of Ngāti Parau, how can we forget that? And maybe if we just go around the room and just start with a pātai, just to tell us briefly about when you were Fulbright, where you went and what did you do?
Kia ora, tēnā koe Tahu, o tira ki a tātou, kua whakimi mai nei mo tēnei kaupapa whakahirahira o te rā nei. Ko Nepia hau, Ngāti Parau. Don't need to know much more than that about me. I think I'm from the coast, and I've been here teaching history, and my Fulbright was an extension of my interest from my PhD. So I at that stage, for me, I'd been writing about Ngāti Parau, it was my world. So I'm writing about Ngāti Parau history, how we do it, and kōrero tuku iho. But I wanted to network and connect, with other Indigenous peoples, and to see if what we did had crossovers and similarities. So that was the driving force behind me doing my Fulbright and what that was about. So that's what sort of took me over there, to try and connect, with other Indigenous peoples, and to broaden, because it's in our solidarity, as Native peoples, where we find, we deepen, we really deepen what's really a global field, history. So it's kind of looking for your allies in a way, and finding people who are saying the same things as you, and like Linda's said, and Graham's like, you create, blow up, explode that space to create opportunities for our knowledge to in our case in history, to redefine the field, hopefully to challenge it. So it was a rather ambitious plan, I think, to go over to a Fulbright to do that, so that was the goal. Just to network and create those connections. So it was a great opportunity, and it really set me up later on to be able to talk more broadly and globally about my work. So it was awesome.
Yeah, Nepia, and also because now you're involved in this really critical mahi around the reset of the New Zealand history curriculum, such a big kaupapa, such a timely one. I wonder if we can return to that a little later and have a bit of discussion around that as well. So Jason, maybe over to you next. Jason, you went to the Native Nations Institute at the University of Arizona, didn't you? Which is really well known for its Indigenous governance program. But you went there for to further sort of develop your ideas and collaboration around Indigenous entrepreneurship, which we don't really hear about, enough. So tell us a bit about that.
Kia ora Tahu, kia ora tātou. Kua hau nei nā, te tahi o nā uri o tūhoi, me Ngāti awa, me whakatohia, me Ngāti kahungunu. Kia ora everyone. Just really, just listening to everyone's bios is far out, man. Nepia, Maia, Tahu, ngā mihi nui kia koutou rā. But also just want to acknowledge Ngāpai and Fulbright for their support and the opportunity to head over to the States through the Fulbright. It was just a wonderful opportunity. For me, my interest is really Indigenous entrepreneurship. You know, what makes Indigenous people want to pursue entrepreneurship, to start a business, and what enables them to be successful when they do undertake that kind of a pathway in life. And with the research here, you know, we've got a growing Māori economy and some wonderful Māori entrepreneurs starting to do some amazing things in a whole lot of sectors. And I was really just wanting to look at, well, what does the scene look like in America, you know, North America, in terms of Indigenous entrepreneurship? How is it different to how we do it back home here? And what enables Indigenous entrepreneurs in the States to be successful? And so I think there's a bit of a theme. You know, we all headed to Stanford, you know, to California, to Silicon Valley, to see what the entrepreneurship is like there. And I was no different. So the first part of my sort of Fulbright was I went to Tucson, Arizona, to the Native Nations Institute at the University of Arizona in the middle of summer. We got off the plane, my wife and our 3 kids, we got off the plane, it was 49 degrees. It was terrible. And it stayed that way for the whole week. And so we were living underneath a air-conditioned machine. And but really what I was really looking at there is this idea of nation building and the concept of, I guess, self-governance and how that affects Indigenous entrepreneurship and enables it. And that was really the focus while I was in Arizona, and got to visit a few tribal nations. And what's big out there? Well, yes, casinos is big time, but also minerals and energy and water and all sorts of things. But also sort of looking at tribal reservations and how they're doing was a big part of it. Then we went to San Francisco and stayed in city of Fremont, but used to commute over to Stanford there, and because you can't rent in Stanford, you know, it's like $10,000 a month or something to rent a little flat. It's just ridiculous. But you know, you commute and you get over there, and it was just wonderful to be in the Stanford community because it's a different world. It's totally plush and palatial, and everything's immaculate, and everyone looks beautiful, and it's just amazing. So to study entrepreneurship in that setting was just awesome. I guess what I found, the biggest thing that I found is that there's 2 worlds there, and one is the sort of the tribal reservation where they're trying to establish private economies and private enterprise on Indigenous reservations there, and that is a big challenge. And the tribal governments there trying their best to do that with the resources that they have, and even with things like casinos and access to sort of raw materials as a basis for economy, it's still a big struggle. Then there's the modern sort of Indigenous entrepreneur in the States who are city-based, and they're just going for it, and they're just amazing. You know what they're doing, using their knowledge and their experiences as people, but they're a diverse community. So there's lots we can learn from it. And the main thing that I wanted to get out of it was an exchange program, but you know, COVID got in the way of that. So that's on hold. But I mean, ultimately, I'd love to get some Indigenous entrepreneurs from the States over here, show them around, show them what we do, and take them to Ngāti Porou and Tūwharetoa and all around.
And Waikato.
And Waikato. Oh yes, can't go past Waikato. Need to stop off and, you know, and give our pay our respects to the king. And then the same for us, you know, send some people over to the States to visit some of the places that I saw and learn from one another, really. So that's me. Kia ora.
Oh, kia ora, brilliant. Ngā mihi e hoa. Maia, so you went to Stanford as well and did your master's there, and then you had a really sort of fascinating journey, and then you went and worked for one of the biggest tribes in Northern California, working on what you'll tell us about that. I gather it was something around water rights, and extending the work that you'd already done in your Masters. And then, of course, you came back to Aotearoa, and now you're tumu whakarai of whai legal, which is really carting a new path. So can you, tell us a little bit, give us a bit of a kōrero about your experiences on your Fulbright?
Tēnā koe e te tuakana o te rā tēnā tātou. I tika me tautoko i ngā mihi kua mihia kia koutou o Fulbright. O ngā pai o te Māramatanga hoki. I think often about the fact that we were so lucky when we think about the impact of COVID in terms of the opportunities that we've had, and particularly, as you said, I went overseas to the States, studied, had an opportunity to work closely with the Yurok tribe there, and then ka tahi ka hoki mai and ki te taha o tētahi o kutinohua, no roto Ngāti Parae, I whakatuwhera I a whai legal. So it was a really pivotal time for me in terms of what I was thinking about doing in my career and the contributions that I wanted to make as an Indigenous entrepreneur, as Jason's talking about. And a huge driver for me was making people feel good about their experience with te ture, particularly Māori, because the law speaks with a sharp tongue to our people. So just drawing in on some of the kōrero that Jason shared about, drivers in terms of Indigenous entrepreneurs. But therefore, the Fulbright journey for me was huge, because actually prior to my departure, I hadn't thought that I'd come back and go out on my own with my colleague Horiana in East Hope, and we now have another colleague, Mihiarangi Piripi. I had thought that I might return and continue under the umbrella of some incredible mentors that I've been lucky enough to work with, no roto Ngāti Parae hoki. And so Fulbright really gave me the confidence to think about different pathways and different ways of doing things, and to assist in what we're hoping to achieve, that market saturation of Māori working in the law and supporting good mahi in the space. And in terms of that mahi, so as you've said, I went over and completed my LLM in environmental law and policy at Stanford. And one thing that I got told talking to mentors of mine when I went over is when you choose your school and you choose your experience, have a really strong, have strong foundations and reasons for that. And so I applied to a range of schools, including on the East Coast, and part of me wanted to go to the East Coast because it felt like what you see in the films and what have you in terms of the law school experience. But I realized quickly that if I wanted to be doing water law, then I had to be on the West Coast. I had to be in a place where they were water scarce, and therefore they were thinking about what does it mean when you're no longer water abundant, and you need to be reflecting on what that means in terms of how all of your water issues therefore converge, and how you have to have difficult and brave conversations. And I knew that that was a better place for me to be. But I was also told too that schools like Stanford, and I had an incredible experience, if they don't have the depth, and at the master's component they didn't, at the, for me anyway, in the law school, at the undergrad component they had a really, really strong Indigenous program, and I know they did in other schools also. But if they don't have the depth, then in terms of Indigenous offerings within the law school, and if that's what you want to be working on, then you need to look at those relationships for yourself. And so there are a range of other reasons why Stanford was a good school, largely because of the innovation that they were looking at around why. But it meant that I needed to hustle to make sure that I could achieve what I wanted to in terms of the Indigenous component of my degree. And so kia koutou e whakaaro here to those of you who are thinking about that. That was really, really important advice for me, and it helped ground the choice of my program. So I just offer that up. So what that meant for me is, and how ka whakaaro Māori tātou, I ended up having a now very, very close friend, pērā ki te tungane, like a brother to me, but at the time just a professional Māori colleague who I knew, who reached out to say, hey, we live up the road, which meant over 5 hours north of where I was. And my wahine is from this tribe called the Yurok tribe, and if you can come, I think it would be fascinating. They're really into water rights issues. I know that you've done some work on the Wanganui River and on the Waikato River, and if you'd like to connect, then let us know. So his name was Rewetsi Wiki, no roto Ngāti Parae, no te ao Pauri hoki. And through a series of conversations and going up there, I ended up doing a presentation to the tribal council. And very quickly it became apparent that there was an opportunity to work closely with the Yurok tribe and to share what I knew and to learn from them. And I, therefore, following my degree, stayed on as the Fulbright-Ngā Pai opportunity allows you to. You can stay on for the same length that you have participated in your program, at least in those were my circumstances. And I worked with the Yurok tribe in their Office of Tribal Attorney, and I assisted them with water rights issues, and actually a range of other things as well in terms of the intersection of tribal, state and federal jurisdictions. So I was admitted to the Yurok Bar. That was incredible, just drawing on what Nepia's talking, the mahi that Nepia's doing around the history project, and thinking about this new movement that we have around history in schools and telling our own history. It was amazing to be given the bar materials, and all of the first part of it was just Yurok kōrero about their creation narratives and their stories. And to be able to study in a way that, you know, I'd been brought up learning about my kōrero tuku iho, but I hadn't necessarily had that same experience at law school until, you know, paper 2 or 3 or elective papers. And so that koira te orokohanga, that was the origin of it, and that's where it started. And then when I came to be admitted as well, they allowed me to bring a bit of our culture, and we're really big on mihi mihi, as you know, as Māori, bring that into the ceremony. And so we had a lovely exchange. In terms of the things that I learnt from them, I had gone over there to see the value of property rights, water property rights in action, and what can be achieved in that regard. I learnt so much more than that. But in terms of the property rights, what I did actually learn is, and it's not to say that in Aotearoa we shouldn't be reaching for that, because there are benefits and disbenefits to every tool, and we need to exhaust our interrogation of those tools so that we come to a place where in Aotearoa we have the best system that works for us and acknowledges tēnei taha Māori I roto te tukinga or te ama te tikanga Māori me te ture, in terms of the collision of those two laws, the first law of Aotearoa and the legal system that we now have. We need to exhaust those options. But I did actually learn that property rights had meant that neighbouring iwi didn't necessarily look to one another for solutions, because they thought, well, I have my thing, you have your share, and I'm going to advance my interests. And so I was able to bring to them a range of examples about why don't, prior to going into negotiations with state or federal governments, we have pre-hui with the other iwi that are in your basin, so that we can be on the same page. It doesn't mean that we necessarily withdraw from our position, but because there are a lot of commonalities that you would share if we stepped outside of this legal process. That is, and we don't want that process to drive what it is that you're doing. Surely we would want our relationships, our enduring relationships, and our close proximity to be the driving force. And that was my experience on the Waikato River, for example, both as an advisor in the legal sense and also as a member of Ngāti Tūwharetoa Iwi in terms of what was achieved there. So there were opportunities where I stepped back, having gone over to learn about all the ways I can make our own system better. I stepped back and was able to appreciate what we had been able to achieve. So he paku kōrero tērā, I could go on for a long time, but yeah, it was an incredible experience. Actually, perhaps I'll say one last thing. The other thing that they talked about over there was they use the term tribal sovereignty and sovereignty every day. And I think in Aotearoa, for reasons that are far beyond any intention of mātou as Māori, the word has become a bit of a dirty word, tino rangatira tangata some, and there's been a sense of reclaiming on the part of people, but others still find it confronting as a word. And so when you use the kupu tino rangatiratanga, when you use mana motuhake, you know that you have to be willing to be bold walking into that conversation. Whereas over there, because of the fact that they used it every day, they assert it every day, there's no question that they had to have bold conversations, but it felt like it came from a different starting point. And in that regard, I do want to encourage us to be talking, using those kupu more often, because I think that they have got to a sense where there's been a disarming in relation to some of the concerns around that kupu, and that was something that that I found really impressive about the steps that they'd taken, notwithstanding the challenges that they face. Kia ora tātou.
Kia ora, Maia, and I'm just reminded I had a very wide-ranging and interesting discussion with one of our pukenga last week about this very concept of sovereignty, tino rangatiratanga, mana Māori motuhake, and the commonalities, but also the distinctiveness between these interrelated kupu, and the way in which this sort of frames our way of thinking about our collective good and our sort of our collective being. So highly relevant here in Aotearoa at the moment, of course, with the conversations around he puapua and so forth. But what I'm really struck with in terms of, even though we're Indigenous history, environmental law and water rights and Indigenous entrepreneurship, there's some very common threads that are coming through your kōrero around our relationality as Indigenous peoples, around the crucial importance of our mātauranga, regardless of where we're sort of situated in our mahi and our rangahau, and also this idea of and this impetus for contribution for the collective good, and going to the United States on a Fulbright is not about career trajectory and individual advancement in the academy or in our fields. It's really about what is the contribution that we can make to something bigger, to the collective. So ngā mihi ki a koutou. I wonder if we can move a little bit now to the theme of Indigenous International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples, and this year there's a theme that sort of animates that World Day, and it's leaving no one behind, Indigenous peoples, and the call for a new social contract. And of course, with the global pandemic, Indigenous peoples have been really at the pointy end of the impacts, the financial, the health, the social impacts of COVID-19 has really exacerbated and amplified the inequities that Indigenous peoples face the world over. Aha ko te horopaki. So I wonder if we can sort of reflect on what this call for a new social contract might mean here in Aotearoa. And I wonder if we can start with you, Jason, this time. How whakaaro?
Kia ora Tahu, big cope over that one. But I guess from my point of view, in the research that we've been doing on Māori entrepreneurship across a range of sectors in Aotearoa, one thing that sort of stands out for me is that Māori economic development and Māori self-determination to be successful in entrepreneurship and enterprise and innovation is being more widely accepted and recognised as an integral part of New Zealand's economy, and it's just being seen as part of the normalisation of te ao Māori within the economy. And previously, like even a few years ago, I guess entrepreneurship and Māori economic development wasn't seen as being central to who we are as Aotearoa, but it is now, and part of that has to do with treaty settlements. Treaty settlements are changing the sort of way in which tribes are perceiving their potential and their ability to pursue economic development, but the need is so great. So what the intention now is turning to is how can tribes support tribal entrepreneurs within their own rohe to start and develop enterprises of their own. And so one of the I guess that's probably a future direction that some of the tribes, especially the post-settled tribes, are taking. And I think I guess one of the challenges is, well, how can we support tribes to do that to a larger degree? Because, as you say, there's a huge social, cultural need amongst our people. Housing and other areas are huge issues. But is there potential for our tribal entrepreneurs to engage in addressing those issues from their own perspective, their own capacities? And I think that's also happening as well. So yeah, a little bit from me. Kia ora.
Kia ora e hoa. And Maia, what what would you sort of respond to around that sort of idea of a new social contract? Because, you know, the kupu social contract sort of gets understood in a range of ways, and from a very sort of soft end of the spectrum, which is just sort of, you know, equal participation and inclusion, more like sort of social inclusion, to a much more sort of ambitious aspirations, which sort of bring us back to your earlier kōrero around, and also what, you know, Jason has also surfaced some of this as well, as around sort of Indigenous-led solutions and mana motuhake. So, you know, where do you kind of see a productive sort of focus based on the sort of vantage point of where you're situated for a new social contract for Aotearoa?
Tēnā koe tawa pātai, Tahu. So in terms of the mahi that I do, I engage on behalf of iwi and hapu with other parties, local government or Crown agencies and private institutions. And a lot of the kōrero is about a partnership agreement that really starts to look like a participation agreement or a consultation agreement. And the discussion starts as a positive relational one, but when you get down, you know, engari mo te whakatinana, when you get down to actually how will we implement this, it becomes heavily process driven, which I think is whenever you get into process in a very detailed way, it's because there's a lack of trust. And to be fair, it can be because there's a concern for preservation in terms of future generations. There might be a really strong relationship at the time, but you're not confident that that will be maintained through the years. But lack of trust can sit at the centre of that. And from my perspective, in terms of a new social contract and thinking about it from a legal perspective, where we're talking now about the collision of these two worlds and two legal systems, tikanga Māori being recognised as a legal system in its own right, then the third, it's not just about, when we talk about the third law, it's not just about our mainstream legal system at the moment taking bits and pieces of tikanga Māori and incorporating it. It's also about making space, stepping back and allowing tikanga Māori to drive the solution, not only in terms of the principles, but also in terms of, as you said, the Indigenous-led aspects of the implementation of that. And the reason why I think that is so necessary is because actually tikanga Māori, from a legal perspective, particularly in the environmental space in which I operate, is already driving the innovative and novel solutions that we as Aotearoa hold up on the world stage and say, look at us, we're doing things that are different and that are better, and they are sophisticated and they speak to who we are as a people. And that is in terms, if we think about legal personality for Te Urewera, legal personality for the Wanganui River, Te Awatupua, the Waikato River mechanisms as well, Te Mana o Te Wai within the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management. That was a project that I worked on upon my return, but it had its foundations in earlier work by iwi and hapu and the iwi leaders groups supporting that mahi. All of these things are things that as a nation, people are saying, I feel comfortable with this, these concepts resonate with me, but it's about when we ask for concepts to move into action and decision-making, that there's a reluctance there. And so for me, the new social contract is about if we recognise the role of Māori, who are never going anywhere because this is our home in this nation, if we recognise that their good intent extends to their neighbours, extends to the other people who live within Aotearoa, then we can recognise that they are more than a safe pair of hands to start making decisions that benefit all of us. Because actually the opposite has been true for the law. The decisions that have been made have excluded Māori, haven't at times excluded other minority groups, and haven't been able to look with a lens that sees those broader interests, provides that context, and therefore crafts law in a way that speaks to their issues. And to me, the lens, the Te Ao Māori lens, can do that mahi. It's always been able to do that mahi. And so for me, that is what the social contract is about. It is about a true delegation of power, a true transfer of power, and in a way, and with the knowledge that that is good for us. It's not just because we need to settle it's not just because it's a part of a TDC settlement and it's a historical issue. It's actually forward-looking. It's actually looking at what's good for the benefit of us as Aotearoa whānui.
And I don't think you'd find any disagreement around the Zoom room at the moment. There's lots of nodding heads. Nepia, you've got, as you know, as a historian, you appreciate. We all as Māori, we all appreciate the importance of moving forward into the future for our mokopuna. Very cognizant of what has happened in the past and our obligations to our tupuna. But as an historian, this is your bread and butter. You think about this every day. You're at this in the middle of a pretty major reset of the New Zealand history curriculum. And when I reflect on my own education, deficient as it was in the 1980s, and I learned way too much about the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and yet coming from Turanga Waiwai and Parihaka, that was entirely absent in the history curriculum. And I never saw any part of my history ever recognised in the curriculum, let alone celebrated. So how would you, where is the sort of connection point between this idea of a new social contract and how we also represent ourselves in these very tangible ways in the school curriculum, and when we think about how our tamariki and our rangatahi are able to see themselves reflected in the curriculum, and the way in which that can be also very empowering or very, as the case of the curriculum has been the last mai rā no, diminishing. Where's the opportunity, I guess, is what I'm asking.
Wow, tino pātai. It's like a PhD question, eh? It's like a thesis, I bet, and it consumes me, Tahu. It does. It's consumed me for a long time. These exact questions about healing our colonial present, dealing with our colonial past, and actually trying to think about a decolonial future where we're empowered. And so when you're circulating, when you're in orbit around something like that and you're thinking about it, you naturally think about, we've just been talking about the importance of being precise around wording. Tino rangatiratanga, what does that mean? What does kupapa mean? What does all of these deep historical labels and these things that we're talking about that represent us, not just as Māori and iwi, but as New Zealanders and as people that are part of different global communities. As a historian, you kind of get really caught up because our job is about telling stories and about understanding the connection between past, future and present stories. So there's plenty of opportunity because those stories are foundational. They're foundational stories that are essentially the key products of identity construction. So, all national narratives and iwi narratives are all identity construct narratives that are deeply political, that are, in our case, about healing. So when I think about, my papa was really big on partnerships and relationships. So it's something that I often think about too in the work and how we deal with that. And we already know in Indigenous studies that we have lots of, there's a literature around relationships, colonized and colonized relationships, insiders, outsiders. It's quite a deep literature around binaries and trying to escape binaries and trying to rethink some of those essentializations. So it quickly gets complex and nuanced. So I think in the New Zealand history curriculum, we're at this point where Māori for a long time have been calling to have our histories included. But in doing that, there's actually other steps to deal with. I like that the theme of Indigenous peoples today, or day today, is about leaving nobody behind, because it's a leadership partnership. I haven't thought so much of that partnership in a decolonial world being equal, because I don't know if you can't create equalness out of this existing unequalness. If you look at our history, up until now, that partnership's never been equal. So how do you resolve that when you aim for equality? I think I prefer to think of it for a starting point strategically to move through what some old old school scholars like Vine Deloria said, you know, we talk, you listen. There's already Indigenous peoples who have said, you need to let us have the reins and take over for a little bit, because we have the knowledge, we have the foundational knowledge in New Zealand to talk about every aspect of our world, from law to geography to history. Māori history is centuries old. It's much older than this very small New Zealand nation state history. So it's our stuff that comes first, and there's no equality in that. You can't talk about that in equal tension, hundreds of years versus a very small century or so. So I think that there's some, to me, the opportunity comes when we start to think about our positionality in our relationships, because, you know, that's something that is really crucial to understanding what each of our roles are in sort of dealing with, like, healing, right, decolonizing. So, and I think Māori already have those terms. So if we search through our tikanga, if you search through Indigenous people's terminologies in tikanga, we have ways of talking about our relationships with people who come into our territories and who engage with us. And I think those, to me, are the building blocks for those opportunities. And then once we start to kind of embed the language of our history with those terminologies, they start to create new stories. It starts to shift the narrative of those stories beyond a national centric focus to something beyond that, because nation making is colonial. And so we need to think really carefully about continuing to perpetuate narratives that actually serve a colonial agenda of assimilation and integration, and think about a different Indigenous narrative that serves more aptly as a national identity that New Zealanders should subscribe to, which includes te reo Māori. So it's Indigenous peoples who, I think, who subscribe for us those narratives of belonging. It's not the nation state. And that's the opportunity, I think, that we've got ahead of us, to be able to come together in a partnership and dialogue to figure out what those national narratives might look like. And then that way we'll see everybody reflected in the curriculum.
And you know what, it strikes me as really what makes part of Aotearoa so distinctive, but which is also so underappreciated and undervalued, is, you know, we've just been having this webinar, and the extent to which te reo Māori is used to communicate ways of knowing and to communicate essential ideas that underpin te ao Māori, and that's just not possible in a lot of countries. We're very, in some ways, fortunate that we have a single language that's mutually comprehensible across all of our iwi and hapu, and we're able to articulate a transformative vision of a flourishing future in our own language that we can all understand, even if we have different views on how we might get there. And it strikes me as that, along with our sort of common understanding of a shared tikanga and kawa, although that might vary from rohe to rohe and marae to marae, but there's a knuckle, a core of it that's mutually comprehensible of tikanga, is to be embedded into our various institutions in ways that empower all of us as Māori, but all of Aotearoa, then it's really just a matter of, can you just move out of the way? Can you just move out of the way, loosen that grip on those reins, and let us lead? And what is so difficult about that? What is so difficult about that? So it's really, it's inspiring to hear these visions of leadership, of contribution, of aroha, of mana motuhake from these different spaces, and also how your time spent overseas amongst other Indigenous peoples and understanding their ways of approaching it have actually enriched your own understanding when you come back here to Aotearoa. We haven't got that much longer, and there might be some questions, but I just want to maybe just conclude on one last sort of pātai for you. And the last couple of weeks has really focused debates and conversations around mātauranga Māori, mātauranga ahapu, aiwi, and the place of mātauranga here in Aotearoa. And there's been a lot said, and also, of course, a lot of very deep kōrero really about the relationship as well to racism, colonialism inside, particularly in terms of our educational institutions. And as sort of academics, Nepia and Jason, but also Maia, you know, you're in the legal world, of course, this will all have relevance for the mahi that you do and the systems that you have to work within as well. What are some of the sort of concrete steps? What are some of the concrete steps that you think need to happen or could happen in our respective institutions that would really enable our mātauranga to flourish?
I'm happy to go first really quickly.
Yes.
So one of the things that has been advanced, I'm actually on the New Zealand Council for Legal Education in Aotearoa Nei, and one of the things that has been advanced is, just as we're talking about teaching of our own histories within kura, is teaching on the basis that if you are a legal practitioner and if ture, and I believe it's axiomatic now, is if tikanga, sorry, is law, then we need people to understand, not just at a very cursory level, but with a depth and breadth, that particular mātauranga, so that they value it, and also so that they appreciate that the knowledge that they'll obtain in law school will only be a small part of that, of a bigger picture of knowledge, and the repositories of that knowledge will sit outside the legal practice, but they will know to respect it and they will know where to go looking. I actually recently hosted a wānanga tikanga for a particular piece of work I'm doing, because Te Ture is now very interested in looking at tikanga, and so we're getting a lot of requests to host these, and I will do so if I feel that the space is safe for those practitioners of tikanga to come into, and that they will be looked after by myself and others. So it is a heavy burden that we carry, but in that kōrero, I tutu mai tētahi tohunga, I roto i te ao tikanga, ka reo ka whakaingoa, engari, he stood up, this particular mātanga or specialist in tikanga, and said, tēnā koutou e ngā roia nei, ngā roia Māori, ngā roia Tahu wike. So he said, tēnā koutou, all of you lawyers, kua hau he roia tikanga. I am a lawyer of tikanga. And there were some other people participating in that wānanga who were more senior to him. And he said, anei ngā kaiwhakawā tikanga, and these are the judges of tikanga. And that spoke immediately to me in this very perfect way about, if we are to teach tikanga within law schools, and I think it is already, it's a horse that's bolted in terms of tikanga already having a relationship with our law, and so I'd prefer that people have a good grounding, then they need to understand those relationships. You know, I am someone who was lucky enough to be brought up with my reo and tikanga, and I still am not a roia tikanga in the way that this man is. And so that level of depth and breadth to the way that we learn and understand mātauranga must equally be shared by people who we are willing to enter into this space, so they have a greater appreciation of the relationship between tikanga and ture. And so for me, it's about knowing and respecting and acknowledging not only the place of tikanga, but the place of the person who's able to participate and engage with that tikanga, and therefore recognising how far they can therefore go. And all of that to me is really important when you're dealing with mātauranga Māori and tikanga Māori. Tēnā tātou.
Kia ora. Nepia, do you want to add to that? There has been some kōrero definitely late in the last couple of weeks around mātauranga and the need for Māori, for mātauranga āhapu āiwi to really be in safe spaces which are independently, independent spaces where Māori can still, for want of a better word, exert control over what happens. People whakaaro around that. Yeah,
the history curriculum that we're looking at is, we want, the idea for those who've been in the working group is to ensure it's local iwi, place-based pedagogy and approaches that underlie those important foundations. But it's easy to say that. It's harder to actually see that manifest itself, because it requires a lot of work. So, and also that impetus of that work puts a lot of pressure on iwi to stump up and be the people doing all the mahi, which is a big ask, but it's completely necessary. So, the tikanga, with the science stuff, listening to the stuff last week, watching Rangi and Tina on the hui the other week, talking about this relationship with science. You know, history has an ongoing problem there too, with the way in which it's Māori history and iwi histories were marginalized and othered and elbowed out of the way in favor of Western empirical approaches to historical sources. But what's really interesting is over the last century, even in the West, like even in their historiography, that empirical narrow-mindedness has been totally challenged, and it's been blown out of the water. So it's interesting seeing people still continue to make those arguments. But for Māori, like you can't we know that you can't do Māori history without understanding tikanga and the pedagogy that sits in behind the way we keep the past and we disseminate it. Our past is a living thing. It's not something that exists just in books. It's a living practice. And so, I agree entirely with Maia. It's like understanding. There's one of the big things that we wanted to push in the curriculum, which I think probably scares the daylights out of teachers and other people, is that you want this history, you want to have this include this New Zealand Wars content and more treaty content, and you can do that. You can put all that content in there, but the tikanga around how you engage with that changes the way in which it's critiqued and which it's laid down and disseminated. And so you can teach bad treaty history. I've seen it all the time. You can teach really bad New Zealand Wars history. You can teach that history and it be absolutely awful if you don't have the right pedagogies and you don't have those right sort of critical pedagogies in place. And so our tikanga and mātauranga is really crucial to that. And it's not, our idea, just to come back to the science issue, our idea of how we validate and we verify that knowledge as well, beyond just that very narrow-minded empirical science. There's so much more behind that. Oral history, for instance, is a really nuanced and deeply scientific approach too. So, and our people have been adept at consistently adapting our ways of knowing the world to include that. So, I'm excited to see what our people will think of in terms of ensuring that everybody in this country knows the history of where you are.
Ka pai. And I'm just thinking, before we move to, maybe we have time for one or two questions, two pārtai, Jason, is I know that tikanga mātauranga has always been really critical to the work you've done on Indigenous entrepreneurship. And, I think about some of the sort of groundbreaking work that like Wakatū Incorporation has done with their Te Pai Tawhiti 500-year strategic plan, and unapologetically Māori in the terms of the values and the aspirations underpinning their vision for their future. So, what are some of the possibilities in the field that you're situated in around sort of mātauranga, ahapua, iwi and tikanga?
Yeah, I think it comes to something that Maia's really picked up on, and that is just having faith and trust in Te Ao Māori perspective, in Mātauranga Māori and tikanga Māori, and its potential to make all of our lives better. And what gets us to that point is a bit of power sharing, and power sharing is really allowing Māori to have a say and to allow Māori knowledge to contribute to what's going to be, what's going to work best in terms of economic development and entrepreneurship. And some of those enterprises like Wakatū and Tuaropaki and others around the place that are sort of demonstrating that Indigenous enterprise can be sustainable culturally, spiritually, economically, environmentally, in all manners. And it's something quite distinct from social enterprise and social entrepreneurship, which is what it tends to be described as. It's something different again, because it incorporates and it's built on those Māori values and Māori knowledge and mātauranga Māori, tikanga Māori, and Māori aspirations and Māori capacities and our reo and our tikanga. So all of that comes into it. And so the future, I think, is really enabling that to happen. Now, what the challenge is for business schools like the one that I'm working for at Massey University, but all of them, to share power and to incorporate Māori knowledge into our business programs, our degree programs, and the way in which we teach. We're starting down that path, but we've got a bit of work to do. It can be done, and it's been proven to be done in the health sector. You know, you look at the nurses and the doctors and the quality of the training that they get around tikanga and cultural safety and te tiriti or waitangi, all these sorts of things are just standard practice. In the business school, not so much. So we've got a bit of work to do to catch up with even the law schools, Maia, you know, in terms of how they're progressing. But it's a real challenge. The other one is that there's a real thirst in our regions around economic development, and they want to understand what is the Māori economy, what is Māori entrepreneurship, and how can we engage with it and support it. Now, who's going to teach them? Hey, you know, and all our hapu and our iwi are stretched. They're trying to build their own economies, let alone help the rest of us get to grips with what that is. But there is a demand for it. So we've got to find ways which respond to that and allow these economic development agencies and private enterprise to understand and engage with Māori, te ao Māori, appropriately, and in a way that does share power, and in a way that is comfortable with self-determination, mana motu hake, tino rangatiratanga, because it's going to be good for us. You know, it's not something to be afraid of, it's something to embrace because it works.
Kapai. Kia ora, Jason, and you won't get any disagreement here. Like, we've only got a few more minutes left, and people have been a little bit whakama, I think, about using the chat window to ask any pātai. I think they've just been sort of engrossed in what our kai kōrero have been sharing. I know I have. I could actually listen to you three talk all afternoon, but we don't have all afternoon because we've got jobs to do. But I wonder if we could, if there are any listeners who want to pose a pātai and just want to unmute themselves and ask that pātai, I think we'll at least have time for one or two. Oh, we've got a shy bunch today.
I'll zoom in if no one else is going to say anything. Am I allowed to ask questions even though I work here? Is that allowed?
Of course it's allowed.
Thank you so much to all of the speakers. I totally agree with Tahu. I was just sitting here listening. Didn't have any questions because you all spoke so well. But something did occur to me. We've had a few grads come through the NZ grad program in the last few years, who I think at the high level would say their ambition is to be CE of their iwi. So they're looking at settlements and economies and resources within their iwi, and looking to that sort of whiz-bang cutting edge business MBA styles in the States, and hoping to download that and bring it home and disseminate that amongst their iwi. And I'm, I guess, really interested to hear, Jason in particular, but also, you know, for all of you, what tips you would give them in terms of picking up that very specific US context knowledge and bringing it home to their own people. What tips would you give them so I can write them down and pass them on?
Kia ora, Pip. I'll just go really quickly. The opportunity to be CEO of your tribe didn't used to be around, and all of my kaumata used to tell me, Nana, don't worry about that. You just go to university, get schooled up, and go out into the world, and then come back. And then, you know, and then you think, oh well, there's ages ago, that's gone. But the young ones now have that opportunity, and the real focus for them needs to be on two things. One is getting schooled up in tikanga, te reo, and tribal history, and being connected and being involved and being seen, and going to the US, to Stanford, to figure out, well, what's going on over there and what can we learn from them. Because without the two, you can't make sense of what the US does and how can it be beneficial for us, because you just can't sort of translate that stuff over here. And the other thing that's happening is we're creating our own models of enterprise and entrepreneurship and economy that incorporate te ao Māori perspectives and mātauranga Māori and everything else that the world has to offer. and you need a filter for that process, and that's the grounding in who you are, where you come from, and making sure you hold on to that tight. So kia ora.
Yeah, kia ora. Thank you so much.
Tautoko ai te kōrero, Jason. I know I couldn't think of anything worse than wanting to be the CEO of my iwi. I actually nui taku aruha ki my relations who want to take that on, but man, you know, and it's funny to think about the CEO as a iwi leader, because I've never thought about iwi leadership as being a CEO position. This is me. But for, you know, I've a Ngāti way of thinking about these, I think, where, you know, tō ringa ki ngā rākau a te Pākehā, te mātauranga o ētahi atu. You know, go out, get that knowledge, bring it back to Ngāti Porou, but kaue wari, hara tō mātou maunga hukurangi te maunga neke. So, you know, when you bring that knowledge back, it has to, the enlightenment of that knowledge has to reflect appropriately off our mountain. If it does that, then it'll be fine. If it's not, then mau taima. So, you know, bringing that knowledge back, that's good. But it's like Jason said, if you know your tikanga, you know your whakapapa, you know what your kaitiakitanga role is, you know what these, you know what your kaupapa is about, then you can safely engage in that negotiation. If you don't have that, then you might be in some troubled waters.
Thank you.
Tautoko hoki ahau, what I would say is that in my role as legal advisor for a number of iwi executives and hapu leaders, when they are making decisions based on the legal advice that you've given them, it's ultimately about exactly what each of Jason and Nepia have talked about, are reflecting, or how will that advice ripple and resonate on the ground. And that is the real skill, I believe, because you can acquire the technical advice from somebody else. And in my case, we can often be in a position to support you in that on the ground thinking, but that's not always the case with other technical advisors. And so you have to bring that, and you have to know how important that is, and know that the buck stops with you in terms of those decisions that you make, and therefore how it will impact your people is actually, in my mind, the more critical part of those, bringing those two elements together that Jason talked about. Tēnā tātou.
Thank you, team.
Ka pai Pip.
Ka pai.
Karawi. And I think we might be almost out of time now, Therese. So thank you for those who have joined in. Therese, I'm not sure if this will be recorded and then made available. You're nodding your head, so I'm assuming that will be the case, so it could have much wider distribution. Thank you to my colleagues. You've just been phenomenal. I'm so glad that I just got to ask the questions and then listen. I've had a lot of fun. Thank you. Now, we didn't start with a karakia to begin our session, but I think it would be a nice way to end if we could have a karakia to close off our session. Jason, my friend, are we able to do that to close the session? And just want to acknowledge as well, again, Fulbright, and of course, big shout out to Ngā Pai o te Māramatanga for being able to support our scholars and our graduates to go to the States to find whatever we want to find, and to bring it back to contribute to the benefit of our whānau and our hapu and our iwi, and that's phenomenal. So big ups to Fulbright-Ngā Pai o te Māramatanga, and I think I'll hand it over to you now, Jason, to close us off.
Kia ora tātou, kia noi tātou. E tō mātou matu nui te rani whakamaumati mātou ki a koe. Kia homai tō mana ki tāna ki runga ki tēnā o mātou i retu tēnei hui huina. Mana ki hua hoki o mātou whānau huri no e te motu. Ka tuku nei nei whakamaumati ki a koe i runga i tengo e tau tumaiti a hukuraiti. Āmene.
Āmene. Kia ora.
Kia ora.
E kuna.